An exceptional show. One of the criticisms I see every now and again in the comment section is that we don't get enough people on who we really disagree with. Most of the people come on here are on the Labour left, they support Jeremy Corbyn. And even though we might have minor disagreements, we're from that same political family. So when I confirmed the lineup for tonight's show, I was more excited than a hashtag follow back pro-EUer, difficult to say that, than when AC Grayling actually follows them back. We've got Wes Streeting in the house. Wes is, of course, one of the most vocal critics of Labour's current stance on Brexit. And tonight we'll be explaining why he thinks Labour should commit to staying in the single market. How are you doing, Wes?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming along.
That's all right.
I'm also delighted to be joined by Tom Kibasi, director of IPPR, a think tank which without a doubt has become the most useful policy factory for the British left, even though it's non-partisan. Tom Kibasi authored the IPPR shared market policy document at the start of this year, which now looks remarkably similar to the position of the Labour front bench. Tom, how are you doing?
Very well. Very pleased to be here.
Pleased to have you along.
Yeah.
Of course, we're having this debate tonight because tomorrow and Wednesday we'll see MPs have their final say on amendments to the EU withdrawal bill. Of those amendments sent back to the House of Commons from the House of Lords, the most significant propose: 1, committing the government to stay, or at least try to stay, within the customs union. 2, giving Parliament more power. So that means that if they vote against the final deal, they'll get to propose what the next phase would be, so they don't just have to vote on a cliff edge or the Tory deal. And a third one, which we'll be debating today, would commit the UK to staying in the European Economic Area, otherwise known as the single market, a situation which is often called the Norway model. Labour MPs will be whipped to back the first two of those proposals, so the customs union one and the one about a real say for Parliament, but they will be whipped to vote against the single market amendment in place Keir Starmer has proposed. It's difficult to remember what the exact language is. They propose the UK having full access to the internal market of the European Union, but not membership of the EEA. Tonight we'll make sense of and debate this position. Is the position of Labour's front bench a deft move to protect the British economy whilst respecting the results of the referendum? Or is it a cop-out that's letting Theresa May off the hook? Wes, we're going to start with you. I'm guessing you won't be following the Labour whip tomorrow. Can you explain why you are so committed to Britain staying in the single market?
Well, I think our current position is a bit of both. You sort of said, are we letting Theresa May off the hook, or is this a sort of deft piece of sort of political positioning in terms of our Brexit policy? And at the moment, it is a bit of both. I will vote for Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn's amendment, the one you described, but I will also vote in favour of the amendment sent to us from the House of Lords from Lord Ali, which would keep the door open to Britain remaining in the European Economic Area. And although you said I'm critical of the party's Brexit policy, I think it's just important to make it clear that actually on the customs union, on the meaningful say, there is overwhelming support. Apart from those MPs who campaign for leave, you will see virtually the entire parliamentary Labour Party united on that, which is good, because when we all vote together, we can beat the Tories, and hopefully enough Tories will vote with us on those amendments. But my concern about the EEA amendment is that in order to protect jobs and safeguard the economy, we have to keep as close as possible relationship to the European Union. The customs union and the position we've adopted there will help protect jobs in sectors like manufacturing and trade in goods, but we've got a mainly services-based economy. So 80% of the British economy is based around services, and in order to protect trade and services, then ideally we should stay in the single market. And for me, the single market isn't just about trade, it's also about social protections. It's about creating a floor in workers' rights, terms and conditions, environmental protections, labour market standards, all of those things that I think have made the single market a success, and why I was devastated we voted to leave the European Union. My frustration about where we are on the EEA amendment is I don't think it's a million miles away from where Keir and Jeremy's own amendment is. The difference is it could attract support and will attract support from the Conservatives. In fact, enough Conservative MPs, I think, will vote for that amendment to eliminate the Conservatives' majority. So if Labour MPs all voted for the EEA amendment, we could beat the government. Now, the challenge we've got is there are lots of Labour MPs who have concerns about the EEA. I'm not enamoured with the EEA as a model. I think it's got some serious drawbacks and pitfalls and problems. But for me, the point of the vote on Wednesday isn't to enforce the EEA on the government and for that to be the model we eventually land on. If we got that amendment through, I don't think Theresa May would say, oh, right, we're staying in the EEA now. What it would do is to shift the centre of gravity of the Brexit debate to a more soft Brexit, closer to Labour's position than it currently is, to protect jobs and livelihoods. And I think it's deeply regrettable we haven't got consensus on this. I'm concerned about the extent to which it's the immigration argument that's torpedoing our chance of beating the government on this. And I think that's a much bigger, more difficult debate for the Labour Party to have. Because ultimately, I think if we dwell too much on the issue of immigration and freedom of movement, we may end up harming our country irrevocably in the longer term on the condition of Brexit. So, I don't pretend this is an easy issue for the shadow cabinet, for the Labour leadership. They've had to try and straddle a wider electorate, some of whom voted Leave, many of whom voted Remain, and the electoral politics is different in different parts of the country, so it's not easy. But, I do think this week we are missing a golden opportunity to defeat the government, to shift the terms of the Brexit debate, and to leave people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and the hardline Brexiteers and the Conservative Party more isolated than now I fear they will be.
Tom, you published a blog on Sunday saying voting for this EEA amendment would be misguided, partly because you say it's an imaginary option. What do you mean?
Yeah, so I've got to come back on a few different points. So let's just firstly, let's be clear. The amendment instructs the government to negotiate for continued membership of the EEA. That means that it's not a request, it's not making an argument for the single market, it's an instruction to the government to negotiate continued EEA membership. So I don't think it's something that you can simply say is, well, this is just purely symbolic, it's encouraging the argument for a close relationship to the single market is an instruction to join the EEA. At that point, the argument you're making is that the model that the Labour Party should adopt is specifically the EEA model. And the argument that I put forward is on two grounds. One, I actually think we want to be have a single market deal. That's absolutely vital. You're completely correct when you say 80% of our exports are services and they're not covered by a customs union. And the proposal that IPPR put forward we call it the shared market in December, was for both for a single market deal and for a new and comprehensive customs union, and putting those two things side by side. So the question that I come to is, if you want those outcomes and you want a single market deal, then why take the model of the EEA, which was created in 1992 through a negotiation between Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein with the EU? Why not negotiate a different model that suits the British economy in 2018? That's the thing that I find puzzling. So that's on the first front. Why would you do it, right? The second bit is just the EU aren't insisting on this. So they're not saying you can't have a deal on the single market that isn't the EEA. If they were saying that, then I would understand the position. I'd say, well, if the choice is an ultra-hard Brexit on the one hand or the EEA on the other, then there would be a logic to supporting the EEA position. But when they're not saying that, why on earth should we? That I find just impossible to understand. Then I think you've also got to get into the feasibility of this. So actually the EEA isn't on the table in these negotiations precisely because it has problems from the EU perspective. So if you set aside Britain's problems with it, which are around sovereignty, so you're required to adopt single market regulations without the ability to say no, and without any control or influence about what those regulations are. So for a referendum that the slogan was take back control, I'm not sure entering an agreement which obliges you to adopt things without any say over them, that seems to be a problem. And secondly, no new deal on freedom of movement. So you sort of put those things side by side, and I just don't understand why promote this flawed model. So if you want to make an argument for the single market, make an argument for the single market, because the argument for the single market is really strong. I think you weaken the pro-European argument, you weaken the argument for the single market by lashing yourself to a model that is clearly problematic, and by the way, which the EU is saying is not on the table.
So actually, I think our positions are probably closer than you would think. The reason why the EEA is because that is the amendment that's come back from the House of Lords this week, and I think we've got to seize every opportunity we possibly can to defeat the hard Brexit brigade in the Tory party and to try and soften the government's position so it's closer to our position on Brexit. Because I agree with what you said. You know, if Keir Starmer were leading the negotiations, then that would be exactly the starting point that you set out. How can we best keep the benefits of the single market? How could we remain in the single market? What kind of deal could we construct? We might even draw on your IPPR shared market paper as the starting point for a conversation. I think we would start from a much better position than the government has if we did that. But we're the opposition, so we don't get to set the terms of the debate. All we can do in parliamentary terms is when we're confronted with votes, we can either vote for them or against them and think about, you know, what follows thereon. So on the EEA amendment, let's imagine for a minute that circumstances were different, that every Labour MP, bar a handful, decide that actually, do you know what, we've got some concerns about the EEA, but we're going to try and inflict this defeat on the Tories because we can. What would happen? Well, the amendment would pass. It would immediately plunge the Conservative Party into a political crisis. Theresa May would be landed with an instruction, as you said, that she couldn't deliver. So on a very practical level, the first thing the government would have to do would be to withdraw their bill and go back to the drawing board and come up with a compromise that is much closer to a softer version of Brexit than is currently on offer. The other thing you would get is the Jacob Rees-Moggs of this world foaming at the mouth because they absolutely don't want anything that looks remotely like the single market and the customs union. They would be going ballistic. It would force some of the more reasonable Remain voices in the Conservative Party to finally show a bit of backbone and to make arguments about protecting the long-term interests of the jobs of their constituents and the economy as a whole. Instead, we're going to end up in a position where perfect has become the enemy of good, where this amendment will fall, where it will be seen as a victory for the government when it really shouldn't be. When, you know, I hope we will still get some victories on the other amendments. Already it looks like the Tories are now fudging the customs union and some of those brave Tory rebels might evaporate again. So I just think part of the frustration of where we are at the moment as a party is we're not in government, therefore we don't get to set the terms. But the Tories don't have a majority, so there is actually a huge weight of responsibility on our shoulders when there are votes, because we know that every vote counts and we can make the difference. And that's part of my frustration with this week. There is a vote that we can win because of Tory rebels, and we're choosing not to.
Except of course they've all melted away, and I don't think
they would on the EEA though, and there are even more than the 13 that have published their names as well.
Well, I think they're melting it away, and I think, to be honest, if Labour were to have a 3-line whip on its MPs to vote for the EEA, I suspect that you'd find that most of the Tory rebels melted away because of all the problems that actually exist with the EEA agreement. So let me put the counter case to you, which is you lash yourself to the EEA model. You then show that you haven't respected the referendum result because you've said that none of the concerns of Leave voters can be adopted or addressed in any way. Right, and that is the fundamental problem with the EEA construct, is that it's possible to come up with a different construct which actually does respond to those concerns that Leave voters have. It's not a hard Brexit. It's not, you know, everything that the extremists want or anything to anything like that extent. But it's possible to come up with an arrangement that actually does show some responsiveness to the concerns that people expressed and the fact that there was a majority who voted to leave. I think voting for the EEA is sort of sticking 2 fingers up to 52% of the population who voted to leave by saying, well, you may have voted that way, but everything will basically remain exactly the same without any responsiveness to their feelings, their sentiments, their desire to leave. You'd still be subject to all single market regulation. You'd still have a European court. You'd still have the four freedoms in full operation. Very hard to see how that responds to a vote that seemed to revolve around sovereignty and around immigration. So that, I think, is the first substantive problem. The second big problem is that if you did issue that instruction to the government and they then went to try and negotiate for the EEA, they would in all likelihood be rejected. And I think if you had a situation where the government went to the European Union and said, we would like to negotiate for EEA membership, and then the European Union said no, which I think they would, then I think you're into a situation where, a bit like when de Gaulle said no the first time, it doesn't generate a softer Brexit. It would actually generate a harder Brexit.
View, yeah.
It would harden views. And that's why it's actually, I think, quite a dangerous strategy for pro-Europeans to be backing the EEA. It shows a tin ear to the concerns of 52% of the population, and at the same time, it risks hardening the position because the Europeans are going to say no to the EEA. And I can explain why they'd say no.
But, well, I mean, I kind of think it's kind of an irrelevant hypothetical, because I don't think that, given that instruction, Theresa May, as I said at the beginning, it's not that she would say, oh, right, okay, Parliament's voted for the EEA, so I'm going to go off and negotiate that now. She would be absolutely infuriated and having to wrestle with a deeply divided party that would be, tearing lumps out of each other on this issue. And I don't think as Labour MPs.
Okay, but isn't that couldn't exactly the same be said? Exactly the same be said for a vote on the customs union. They would produce exactly the same outcome, because there are a whole bunch of Tory MPs who clearly have never read any evidence, examined any facts on trade policy ever.
Yeah, that's
right. And that's why they're desperate for this independent trade policy, because it's based on this fantasy that somehow, being a small island nation, that being agile in trade negotiations is better than being that it beats scale, right?
Sure, but
now wouldn't you get exactly the scenario you described on a position that your party is united around, which is on the customs union? So why do this on the EEA, which has all the drawbacks that we've talked about? I just don't get it. Why do it?
On transitional arrangements on the customs union, those are two really good examples of where Labour, by passing amendments and shifting our policy, has shifted the terms of the debate. So the Tories are now in a complete mess over customs, precisely because we put them on the ropes on the customs union, and so there they are, kind of having to kind of twist themselves up into knots to, is it a union? Is it are they arrangements? They're all sorts of knots and contortions. And I'd like the same to happen on the single market, and this week would be an opportunity to do that. But I don't imagine for a minute that passing an EEA amendment would lead to us being in the EEA. More generally, on respecting the result,
isn't the response that then comes back to you that says, so people have voted in a referendum, they feel tired of politics as usual.
Yeah.
And the explanation you're trying to give to them is that you're voting for something you don't believe in and you don't think is going to happen, but you're doing it because you want to sow division on the other side. I mean, that's the kind of politics.
No. As I say, it's about shifting.
No?
For me, it's about shifting the centre of gravity of the Brexit debate closer towards a soft Brexit that protects people's jobs and livelihoods, and sort of far from being a sort of craven partisan point. This is about how do we, as Labour MPs, honour the title of our party, protecting the interests of Labour at the heart of this debate, with a small L, workers' rights, jobs and interests. And the difficulty I've got is, and it goes right to your point actually about what do we do about the Leave voters and addressing their concerns. Well, I don't want to dwell too much on the EEA architecture. I don't think that's where we're going to land, but at least in the EEA you would be outside the European Union. At least in the EEA it would be a court of arbitration rather than the European Court of Justice that makes those decisions. At least with the EEA there are some restrictions on freedom of movement that we can apply, some of which we can apply right now, by the way, but we choose not to, as well as emergency brake on freedom of movement, which is provided by the treaties of the EEA. But hopefully, one good thing that's come out of the debate about the EEA within the parliamentary party, and hopefully within the wider Labour Party, is that we're finally wrestling with some of the thorny issues, the really difficult thorny issues that were at the heart of the referendum and which are difficult for the Labour Party. Immigration and freedom of movement being one of them, because my worry is, for example, once you get to debate about freedom of movement and immigration policy in the Labour Party, there will be some of my colleagues saying we've got to have a tougher stance on immigration because that's what our voters want. And the problem with that, the problem with Brexit as a whole, is it leads to us pursuing policies that we know will cause harm and damage for people in our country, the voters that we were founded to protect. And ultimately, I don't want to make my constituents' jobs less safe in order to make my job easier in terms of managing the politics. I think at some point we've got to be courageous and take on some of the myths around the debates about immigration, about what will genuinely safeguard the good of our country, but also dealing with, and this is an area where we get enormous consensus in the Labour Party, the underlying drivers of Brexit, the gross inequality, the fact that people have seen their jobs lost or living standards eroded, their public services decimated. Those are issues where we get a lot more consensus, but solving those problems will be a lot harder outside the single market than inside it.
Let's get on to the broader strategy in the moment of how Labour deals with a divided country, but I want to just clarify, you're going to vote for the EEA amendment without actually thinking staying in the EEA is a good idea?
No, to be honest, as I said at the Parliamentary Labour Party this evening, we may get to a point with the form of Brexit that the Tories negotiate and get through Parliament, where we will look at the EEA as the sunny uplit lands, in spite of all of the problems that Tom has associated with the EEA, in spite of the pitfalls that I think exist within the EEA. I think the EEA as an option would be a much better safeguard than many of the alternatives of a Tory hard Brexit. What I'm saying is, I agree with Tom in that there would be a better form of Brexit than the EEA, but we mustn't let perfect be the enemy of good, because so long as the Tories are in government, they drive the parliamentary agenda. The opportunities for Labour to influence the direction of Brexit in a meaningful way are few and far between. And we can see that with the importance of the vote where we'll all be voting together this week on the meaningful amendment. If that doesn't pass, or frankly, even if it passes and the Tories try some trickery around what they define as meaningful, that is, that's quite difficult. That's why I think this vote actually was a missed opportunity, because we would have shifted the terms of the Brexit debate.
I just struggle to see why isn't just go down a straight line and say, well, can argue for the single market, which the new amendment I think that Keir Starmer's laid down does, argue for a new and comprehensive customs union, which is the position of the Labour Party. That seems like a pretty straightforward way to argue for the single market, is to argue for the single market, to argue for the customs union, is to argue for the customs union. And it feels just a bit orthogonal to then have a big argument about an agreement that was negotiated for Norway in 1992. So I struggle to see the utility of it, and it seems to me a very odd way to pursue a strategy is to come at it at such a odd angle.
Having been in Parliament for 3 years, there are lots of things I find odd about it. One of which is that the government does dominate a huge amount of the legislative agenda, and we don't get on Wednesday. One thing is absolutely certain in all of these votes, that Kieran Jeremy's amendment, which I will comfortably, happily vote for, has zero chance of passing, because it won't secure any rebels from the Tories, maybe one a push, voting for it.
I mean, there is a bigger question
here.
The
point is about picking the fights where we can win Tory rebels across, and then seizing those moments to inflict a defeat on the Jacob Rees-Moggs of this world and shifting the terms of the debate. And that's what we've got to... We're not going to do it on Wednesday now on the EA amendment either, but we've got to look for those opportunities.
The bigger argument that needs to be made is that Brexit can be seen as a political departure, but it doesn't need to be an economic rupture.
Yeah.
And that, leaving the customs union and single market behind and pursuing this kind of ultra hard Brexit, to my mind, right, that isn't just cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's gouging out your eyes for the sake of completeness. Like, it is a truly extraordinary position for us to have reached, to say, and I think a lot of what drives it is this sort of idea that kind of, for consistency's sake, well, we're leaving the EU and therefore we must leave everything in a kind of coherent manner, is a very odd way to pursue things. But the bigger argument I think that needs to be made is, just because you're leaving a political union doesn't mean that you have to end economic cooperation, and that's the big argument that ought to be being made across the board.
And you'll get actually very broad consensus about that across the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I think even in the debates over the next couple of days, you will hear a pretty consistent, unifying message around that point. But as the opposition, we don't get to always pick the battles. So where an opportunity arises to where you can win Tory rebels across and beat the government, I kind of think we should seize them. And that's kind of why I felt like sort of banging my head against the desk at points in the last few weeks, because I kind of think, I understand what colleagues are saying, I understand the difficulties, some of the choices, some of the compromises. This isn't perfect, but let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. And where there's a chance to beat the Tories and plunge them into political crisis, let's grab it, knowing that actually in this case, it won't just be for partisan interest, it will be serving the national interest as well. But we are where we are. And ultimately, we've got to try as best we can to now look at the future opportunities coming down the track to try and get the single market on the agenda. Because otherwise, the time is running out, the clock's ticking. 2019 is around the corner. We may end up leaving on pretty hard terms. And personally, in spite of all the effort that's been put into a meaningful vote, I would not put all my eggs in that basket of hoping that we'll be able to vote down the deal when crunch comes to the crunch. I think there'll be enormous political pressure on MPs, particularly those in areas that voted leave, to vote for a deal, any deal, because people in lots of places just want out. And ultimately, the two votes that we'll be judged by a lot of voters are: did you vote to trigger Article 50? Did you vote for the deal? And this is going to have a long-running impact on our country.
But you don't think that in a Leave area, did you vote to stay in the single market will be an issue, just in the same way as did you vote for Article 50?
No,
I mean, because this is also,
Well,
from the Labour front bench's position, they're positioning electorally, right? So you're saying this is an opportunity to defeat the Tories. But for one, I know you have differences of opinion with the Labour leadership, but presumably you agree they also want to defeat the Tories.
Oh yeah, of course.
And I don't see why the customs union vote, where the rebels have sort of melted away, would be any different to the single market one. And
because
then
it's
you'd be
about
left
shifting
in
the governments, because the customs union is a really good example of where, by shifting our position on the customs union, and it took a couple of rebellions to shift the position of the party on that, by shifting our position on the customs union, we did shift the government's position ultimately. Because Theresa, this is the great thing about the outcome of the last general election. The Tories don't have a clear majority, so Labour votes count, and our position does matter.
So I think it does matter, and I'd love to give you credit, but I do think to some extent, right, the facts just shifted the position on the customs union. I mean, it's such
facts, trade unions, members. I think all of those things
I
had
think,
a really big impact.
Yeah, exactly. I think just leaving the customs union is such an obviously idiotic thing to do, and the scale of unnecessary disruption for no benefit that comes from it. I think what we've seen repeatedly in these negotiations is that the Prime Minister says no to everything. So she has a kind of what I call the no strategy.
Yeah.
Right? You say no, it is no strategy, and it is to say no to everything. So she says no to everything, and then gets close to the edge of the abyss, peers over the other side, and then suddenly folds altogether. And I think we've seen that on the Irish backstop. I think the extraordinary thing, and I don't quite understand how this has been missing from the conversation, was that they gave up £40 billion, and in return, all the government got for £40 billion was a 21-month transition. That's nearly £2 billion a month. I mean, it makes the billion quid to the DUP seem like a
small change.
It seemed like small change. And the reason that they got nothing but a 21-month transition for 40 billion quid was they haven't asked for anything. This is the extraordinary thing in Brussels. They're sort of saying, well, we kind of expected you to ask for things that are clearly in your own interest, like comprehensive access to the single market, like remaining in the customs union. And yet the government keeps repeatedly not asking for anything that in a normal negotiation you would ask for, things that were obviously in your interest.
Yeah.
So you're on this really odd position at the moment with Brexit, where you've got a government that, because it's so divided in its party, can't actually conduct any kind of serious negotiation in Brussels. All it is a negotiation between, the sort of super loopy end of the Tory party and another part that's only barking mad.
I think you're going to agree on the Tories' incompetence when it comes to negotiating Brexit.
I know, it's always worth repeating.
It's worth repeating, but I want to get back to the controversial stuff. Forgetting the vote on Wednesday, because I feel like we've covered that a lot.
Yeah.
Let's talk about broader Brexit strategy. So you are of a particular part of the PLP that has sort of pitched your flag, if that's the correct phrase, I'm not actually sure, very close to the idea that Labour should go hard Remain. They should stay in the single market, although you seem unsure as whether they should stay in the single market. But
no, we should absolutely stay in the single market.
But maybe not via the EEA, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, the EEA is a way, a means of staying in the single market, yeah.
So, and you don't think it would be disastrous for the Labour Party to basically say freedom of movement is going to continue as it always has, and that all the reasons that people voted to leave, there's no possibility of those actually changing? Do you not think that the Labour Party would be seen as incredibly undemocratic and that would damage them at the polls?
I think we should be really clear about the fact that if we were in the driving seat of the negotiations, that we would look at whether reform of freedom of movement could be a possibility. We should be clear about the controls that we can apply to freedom of movement within the current rules of the EU, but bizarrely we choose not to. I do think at some point, though, we are going to have to confront the immigration debate, because for too long, I think two things have gone wrong actually on the immigration debate. One is you kind of get this argument that says, well, immigration is good for our country. Look at the headline macroeconomic figures. It is just a good thing, and we should say it's a good thing. And then you get the argument that says, my voters absolutely hate freedom of movement and immigration, so therefore I want to be really anti-immigration. And actually, the immigration debate is much more complicated than that. There is no doubt, in my view, that immigration has been a good thing for our country, economically, culturally. We should say so. I also have no doubt that in different parts of the country, there have been dislocating, disruptive impacts of certain types of migration. Some of that concern is about concern of race to the bottom in terms of wages. Some of it is about access to public services. Some of it is about is more cultural and about, you know, I used to know my neighbours and they used to speak English and now they don't. There are a range of things going on, and we should duck any of that. My worry is that we're getting to a place now where, as a party, we would indulge or worse pursue policies that might be harmful for our country in terms of immigration in order to be seen to be appeasing voters' concerns. And I think that's irresponsible, because ultimately you don't solve any of those problems, and you could make people's lives materially worse by harming immigration. But the flip side is, I mean, you know, I actually happen to think that my views on immigration would not be a million miles away at all from Diane Abbott's and Jeremy Corbyn's views on immigration. So my worry is about, you know, when I have this debate with colleagues in the tea room and parliamentary Labour Party meetings about the immigration debate and how it plays on Brexit, I kind of think we're going to end up in the worst of all worlds, where we pursue a Brexit policy which is all about ending freedom of movement on the pretense that a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, with Diane Abbott as Home Secretary, would be pursuing a tougher immigration policy than the European Union. I don't see it happening. And in terms of that immigration debate, as I say, I'd be much closer to their position than people who are saying, oh, we've had enough of immigration. But I don't think we're solving many problems at the moment. And, you know, I think we've got to put forward policies to the public that are credible, that make their lives better and improve their quality of life and their conditions. And I think we are misleading working class voters up and down the country if we say, pull up the drawbridge, stop the migrants getting in, your lives will be better. I don't think that's true. I think this country will be materially worse off if we were to pursue a much harder immigration policy.
Yeah, so I think on immigration, it's one of those things where actually, if you look at what the public think, you've got about 15% are just hostile to all forms of immigration. And the hostility is pretty intense. So the hostility almost goes to just kick anyone out the country who wasn't originally born here and is a sort of white nationalism. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got 15% of people who are kind of free movement for the whole world. It's completely open borders. Borders are sort of a regressive thing. Actually, there's 70% of people who are in the middle, and they don't expect a sort of absolutist stance on immigration. What they expect is more control. So they want a feeling of a system that has more control. And I think it is actually possible to have a compromise on freedom of movement that reflects that. So there are three parts to that compromise. The first part is about enforcement measures that already exist on the freedom of movement. So in Belgium, if you show up in Belgium and you're there for 6 months and you don't have a job, the Belgian authorities will send you back to wherever you came from within the EU, because it's free movement of labour, not free movement of people, and they enforce those measures. The second part is about access to welfare payments, and there's a precedent clearly from the pre-referendum negotiation that settled those questions about a sort of fair and reasonable basis for access to welfare payments and reform those. The third part gets to the real heart of the issue on free movement. Why did the UK... So the UK is 8% of the EU's population, and yet has had 25% of internal EU migration, so 3 times its sort of proportionate share, if you will, of total EU migration. Now, why is that? Part of it is about there being jobs here. Part of it is about speaking English as a common language. But a big part of it has been this massive deregulation of the labour market over the last 30 years, whereby you can have anyone show up and do pretty much any job. And in other countries, they regulate the labour market more tightly. As a result, they have higher wages, higher levels of productivity, and they also have lower rates of immigration. Tomorrow, I could quit my think tank job and go and say, I'm going to be a plumber, and I could go around ruining people's heating and plumbing systems, and no one could stop me from just saying, I'm Tom's plumbing services, right? Because there's no regulation about who gets to participate in the labour market. So the third bit is about labour market regulation. In 2016, another referendum happened that doesn't get much attention, which was the Swiss referendum on specifically the question of freedom of movement. and the Swiss rejected freedom of movement. And there was then a compromise negotiated with the EU that's it's called the local labour market preference system. And what that says is in particular places and particular sectors where there is unemployment or other issues at play, preference can be given to Swiss job seekers before EU job seekers. So you could imagine in the UK, we know that in the northeast there are high levels of structural unemployment of people who were pushed out of work when Thatcher led her process of destroying the industrial base of the UK. You could very reasonably say that, actually, if you've got a skilled manufacturing job in the northeast, we have high numbers of structurally unemployed people with from skilled manual work, then actually people in the northeast who are already living there get preferential treatment. Now, the EU says that the Swiss local labour market preference doesn't violate the principle of free movement. It's a modification to the arrangements about how it's implemented. So as a result, I think actually it is perfectly possible to negotiate a compromise that works quite effectively because it has the enforcement measures that already exist, the access to welfare thing, which people are concerned about, and finally getting to the heart of the issue, which is our excessively deregulated labour market, is the root of the problem, not the European rules on freedom of movement. You solve the way that the labour market is regulated, and if you do that, be good for workers, be good for British productivity, and also it will naturally reduce the rate of immigration and reflect people's concerns.
I just want a clarification there. So all of those potential sort of compromises that the government could make with reference to migration to try and satisfy sort of like the popular will that was expressed in the referendum, would they be possible in the EEA, the EU, or the shared market in your analysis, or is there a difference depending on which of those options the government chooses?
So the problem with the EEA is that you would then have to negotiate that also for Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. So if you have a new agreement between the UK and the EU, our shared market proposal, that is what you would negotiate. And because you've got precedents, actually you're on pretty strong grounds for having that ask, because actually the EU has agreed to those things in the past for other third countries. Within the EU, you have to have stricter application of the rules, precisely because you're in the club and they bind all of the 27. If you're creating a new agreement, you could agree to bring in new measures that are based on precedents from other agreements. So our shared market proposal, every single component of it is constructed from areas where there are precedents already in place, and it puts them together in a new and different form, but every part of it is based on precedent.
So it basically looks a bit like the EEA, but it's a new one that's negotiated.
So it looks like
a similar situation to the Norway model, but without tying ourselves to Norway.
So it has three distinct features from the Norway model. So one, you're not tied to the other EEA states. So it is an agreement that reflects the British economy rather than being one that reflects Norway in 1992. Secondly, we propose retaining the possibility to diverge and having proportionate consequences for doing so. And that, from a sovereignty perspective, is really important. So it's saying the objective is to stay in alignment, but we allow for the possibility of divergence. And that's how you secure this question of sovereignty. Now, because we're not believers in this have your cake and eat it model, what we say is that if you diverge, there needs to be a proportionate set of consequences for making that choice to diverge. And that means that Britain would have to have a mature debate to say, well, if we're going to diverge on this, we will pay a price for doing it, because you can't have the benefits without the burdens at the same time. The EEA agreement doesn't allow for that. So the EEA agreement says you've just got to implement it, and that's that.
So it's all or nothing with the EEA, right? You either implement what the single market has decided, or you have to leave.
Yeah, so it's slightly bizarre. So it's all or nothing, apart from the fact that there is a massive loophole, which is why the Europeans won't let us go into the EEA, because there's what's called the implementation loophole. So the EEA agreement says you've got to adopt all these things, but it doesn't give a time frame in which you have to adopt them. So you can just never quite get round to it. And whilst everyone trusts, nice Scandinavian country like Norway to do the right thing and implement the regulations, and for the most part they do, but there's still a big implementation backlog, which the EU are not very happy about, right? They actually, the phrase they used with me was, what's fit for a lamb is not fit for a lion. And they just don't believe that we would honour the agreement, the spirit of the agreement, and they think that we would just pick and choose, do exactly the cherry picking that they don't like, and we would pick and choose the bits of the single market regulation to implement and ignore the bits that we didn't, which is probably true. That is probably what we would do. But that isn't going to happen because they're not going to let us in on those terms because they know that's what we do. And the other reason they know that's what we do is that a procession of Tory ministers went around last year saying that we'd go around undercutting the EU. So they're all worried about undercutting because cabinet ministers went out there and said, we'll undercut given half a chance.
All right, so Wes, forget about parliamentary arithmetic. Do you prefer the EEA to Tom's shared market model, or would you happily sign up to the shared market model if that fit your parliamentary strategy?
Yeah, I'm less concerned about form and more about function. So I mean, I'm really interested in Tom's paper, and if we had a Labour government that was leading the negotiations, I think it would be a really interesting kind of starting point to take to the EU. I mean, there are definite risks, as Tom said. If you diverge further down the track, that presents all the same sort of risks to jobs, to livelihoods, to trade that we've already talked about. I obviously also agree with Tom, and as you would expect a Labour MP, massively about lifting the floor in terms of terms and conditions and sort of labour market standards. It's one of the reasons why I've been banging the drum about Uber, not because I have a problem with people taking cheap cabs around, but when you look at what's behind it, you know, the diet of low pay, aggressive tax avoidance, venture capital subsidising artificially low fares. I think that kind of
national insurance,
the Uber economy is the kind of what a lot of people have as the vision of the future of our entire economy, and you know. So I, that's why I would strongly agree on that. I mean, the only other thing I'd just say about movement of labour is the other reason why people are coming to the UK isn't just about the common language, the desirability of the UK as a destination. It's also because we want them to come here. We are recruiting nurses from Europe. Without Portuguese nurses, for example, the waiting times at my local hospitals would have been much worse. We have got near full employment in this country, and we can obviously acknowledge the fact, unlike the Tories, that a lot of that is low-paid, insecure work and people having to cobble together a meagre existence through lots of low-paid work and long hours. But, we are bringing people to this country because our working age population over time is going to shrink. Our population is ageing, and our ageing population is growing. So in terms of affording social care, in terms of affording pensions, we are going to need to recruit people into this country who are working and doing good work, but also paying their taxes to help fund our public services. So there's got to be, I think, a greater degree of honesty about the debate on migration, and that's why I get very, very nervous listening to some of the arguments my colleagues have made about why they're uncomfortable with the EEA. It tends to be less. And also, I think this will apply to our voters, by the way. I don't imagine there are loads of Labour or potential Labour voters around the country saying, what's Labour doing on the EEA on Wednesday? I don't think people are following the Brexit debate that closely. Yeah, but this is a proxy for much more difficult arguments for the Labour Party.
I agree, but if you go for the EEA, right, you go straight into, you accept the current terms for how freedom of movement operates. That's the issue, right? That you can't negotiate that compromise. The compromise I talked about, right? You can't do that if you go into someone else's agreement.
Which is why I think, as I say, that's why I think the EEA would work as a framework and sort of effectively a sort of worst case scenario in terms of the soft Brexit options that exist. It wouldn't be if I were the Prime Minister or we had a Labour government and I was writing our Brexit policy. I wouldn't be going in saying, EEA, guys, look, this is fantastic. I would be going in with something much more closer to the position you've set out. But, we aren't leading the negotiations, and what we have to do is exert every bit of influence we can through parliamentary votes to drag the Tories away from the clutches of Jacob Rees-Mogg, closer to what I think would be a vast majority of common sense across Parliament. But of course, the other challenge is a lot of the things that you've said in terms of raising labour market standards and workplace protections are the sorts of things that are the exact opposite of what's driving the Brexit agenda, and the future that people are carving out for our country at the moment, who are in the driving seat of the Brexit negotiations, is a deregulated offshore tax haven off the northwest coast of Europe that thinks is going to be able to strike trade deals across the world and without consequence.
I mean, our polling on this stuff is really striking. The public think that through Brexit they're voting for re-regulation, not for deregulation.
Yeah, they're in for a shock.
It is the agenda of a very small group of these the Brexiteers who are promoting this really extreme version of the UK that actually doesn't have the support of either Leave or Remain voters. Right, that vision for Britain, the sort of Singapore on Thames, is not something that commands support really.
No, I agree, but they are a sizable organised force.
Oh no, I agree. I'm just saying that it doesn't have popular
and that's
support.
That's partly why, because I haven't rebelled consistently throughout the Brexit process. I voted to trigger Article 50 because I thought it was important to show we respected the result of the referendum. I don't look at the order paper and think, how can I rebel this week on Europe? I have been.
Do you think any of your colleagues see that?
I have been prepared. I can't speak for all my colleagues. I'll never, it's like herding cats in the Parliamentary Labour Party sometimes. Where I've got a lot of sympathy for kind of where the front bench finds itself at the moment. But ultimately, we've got a position where we've got to be outriders as well, and that's why. In spite of the Labour, and I do take the whip seriously. I was a councillor for 8 years. I was deputy leader of my council. I do actually take the whip seriously. But I do think it's important to have a group, an organised group, that's offsetting the influence of Jacob Rees-Mogg and co on
I just
our
think
benches.
signing up for something that where you say we're going to have no say and no change to free movement probably isn't the best way to prosecute.
No, I don't think there's
argument.
no change on freedom movement either, Tom. I do think the break is significant. I do think that the sorts of controls that we could exercise now and undertaking to exercise those controls if we're in government, I think that would get a hearing. But ultimately, we've just, as best we can, we've got to try and drag the government out of the clutches of Jacob Rees-Mogg and co and into a more sensible position because, the government could fall apart and some weeks I wake up, I look at the papers and I think, game on, general election time, and I'll be spending all my time in Chingford and Woodford Green and Thurrock and Rochford and Southend East and all these other seats near me that we need to win a Labour government. I bring it on. I fear that Brexit, in terms of at least this stage, the Article 50 phase of negotiations, be done and dusted before we have a Labour government. So we've got to do everything we can now as an effective opposition to shift the centre of gravity of this debate.
I'm going to come in and ask the Labour factional question because you're a policy guy, you're from a non-partisan think tank. But obviously lots of people watching our show will think there's potentially a different motive behind sort of like your positioning on Brexit. And especially, I'm going to put myself in the position of the Labour leadership.
Yep.
How I'd approach Brexit if I was the Labour leadership is you recognise there's a divided country. A culture war isn't particularly helpful to Labour's project. We want to win an election on the basis of it being for the many and not the few. Mm-hmm. We want to be re-regulating the economy and we want to be distributing wealth. If there is a massive identity-based issue which splits our base, then that really screws over the prospects of Labour winning the next election. The problem with supporting the single market is that already exists. It's a thing which, to me even, that looks like you're not leaving the EU. It looks like you're basically taking on all the rules as they are, which is precisely why, in fact, Labour haven't signed up to it. So that's why Keir Starmer's come up with a policy which looks, which has a lot of the same benefits, and there'll potentially be a somewhat marginal difference between the status quo, but it looks very different and it has some sort of important technical differences that you've explained already. But politically, do you not think it's dangerous for Labour to back the single market because then that makes them the Remain party? And to ask a more cynical question, do you think that some of the backbenchers who are so committed to Remain plus are not particularly concerned about the electoral costs that would have at a general election because they don't really want to see Jeremy Corbyn be the next Prime Minister?
Well, I definitely hope that last point isn't the case. And all I could say to you is that when you look at the breadth of support for the single market in the Labour Party, it spans the spectrum of Labour opinion. That applies in the Parliamentary Labour Party. When you look at the trade union movement, some of Jeremy Corbyn's biggest supporters in the membership all support the single market, and for very good reason. That's because in order to do the things that we want to do as a Labour government, to tackle austerity, to make sure our public services are properly funded, to end the race to the bottom in workers' pay terms and conditions, the single market better enables you to do that. And the worst thing for an incoming Labour government would be if the deal is already done, our economic prospects have been torched in the process, and you have John McDonnell or another Labour Chancellor in the Treasury dealing with the long tail of the economic fallout of Brexit, because the voters, whether they voted Leave or Remain, they won't blame Brexit. They will blame the Labour government, and we know how toxic the issue of the economy can be for Labour parties in opposition seeking to be in government and Labour governments themselves. So I think we've got to be really, really careful about that side of things. And the final thing is that the electoral politics of this isn't straightforward. At best, the polling is confused. It's definitely confusing. I don't think looking at the polls you can kind of draw a conclusion that if Labour were to be pro-single market that we'd hemorrhage loads of votes. Let's not forget that Remainers can go somewhere too soon. And as I often joke, if there were a nuclear Armageddon tomorrow, there would be two things that survive: cockroaches and Liberal Democrats. Across the country, you see a resurgence of the Liberal Democrats in those sorts of remaining areas. You look at the seats, even some of those northern seats, where you look at the number of people who voted Remain in those heavily Leave areas. We can't take those voters for granted either. So I think that what Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer have tried to do since the referendum has been right in terms of the tone of trying to bring the country together, of trying to say we're going to find a way through it. But I think, and this is kind of my massive anxiety was sort of played out in your question really, my worry is that there are people on the left of the party who are cynical about the single market, who have bought some of the Lexit arguments against the single market, and therefore not only are we kind of not potentially going to push for the single market because of electoral concerns, but because actually there are people in our party who don't want us to be in the single market. I don't know if Jeremy Corbyn fits into that category. Certainly the shift in terms of the content of the amendment this week is the first time that I've seen something resembling kind of single market at the heart of our positions. I hope we're moving in the right direction on that too. But I do worry about the single market debate, and it's why it's a good debate to have, is why I agreed to come on, because I think that although there are some on the left who have argued that the single market is a capitalist club, it hasn't served the interests of workers, and though I would accept that the European Union has its faults, when you look at how the world is changing, when you look at the shift of power away from nation states to multinational corporations, when you look at the race to the bottom in terms of pay, terms and conditions, the single market isn't just a trading bloc. The single market is a social protection. It is social insurance. It is the best safeguard that we have against that kind of race to the bottom. And that's why I don't think we should abandon it. And I think we should do everything we can to fight for it. And that's why I'm going through the lobby that I am this week.
We'll get onto the Lexit arguments in a second. I just want to push on one thing, because I think that one thing that worries me and that I don't find very convincing when people from a certain wing of the party talk about how the only way to be anti-austerity is to support single market membership is, one, because we were in the single market for 8 years and we still had austerity. So
that's a choice of a conservative government.
That's a choice of a conservative government. But also it seems to suggest it's a similar there is no alternative argument, which was used by Hillary Clinton, which was used by the Remain campaign, which was to say you might not like these undemocratic supranational structures and agreements, but you've got to suck it up because it's the only way. And I feel like if that's the position that Labour go into at the next general election, if they say, we know you voted Leave and we know you voted against some of the tenets of the single market, but ultimately you were being kind of immature, you didn't realise that you have to be integrated into the global economy in exactly the way that we were before. That seems like an electoral catastrophe to me. And I just find it difficult to believe that you think that if Labour go into the next election saying we should stay in the single market, there is no alternative, that's going to be a successful message to sell in the current period in which we live.
No, I think we certainly shouldn't kind of go and say there's no alternative, suck it up. I actually thought one of the best speeches that Jeremy Corbyn gave during the referendum campaign, I think it was one of his early speeches actually, where he kind of was, I think it was his first, this is why you should kind of Remain speech. And what I liked about it, and there were lots of raised eyebrows because I was actually given the opportunity to go on the telly and say something nice, but there are lots of times I agree with the Labour leadership, but that's not as interesting as the times I disagree with the Labour leadership. But I went on BBC and on Sky to say actually, and they expected me to say, oh, this was terrible. Jeremy was sort of not as pro-European as I wanted him to be. And actually, what I liked about Jeremy's speech was its authenticity, which is his strongest point anyway. And he wasn't saying vote Remain because it's fantastic and this is, there is no alternative. He was saying, throughout my time in politics, I've had my criticism of the European Union too, but for all of these reasons, I think this is why it's right to remain. And we've got a Remain and reform message. I actually think if the overall Remain campaign, the cross-party one, had been a much closer aligned with the Remain and reform message, we probably would have swayed just enough votes to tip that narrowly balanced referendum in our favour. And I think that's the tone that the Labour Party should keep. If we're in the single market, we should be talking about how we want to extend workers' rights, extend environmental protections, go even further, and push the European and show leadership in Europe to do those things. I also think that when you look at what's going on across Western democracies at the moment, a big part of our manifesto next time has got to go even further than the last one in terms of shifting power closer to the people, radical redistribution of power to towns and to regions, not just to cities, but also redistribution of power from conglomerates of nation states as well to bring decisions closer to the people. Because I do think there is a fundamental underlying problem with the way that globalisation has panned out, in that it has been a very simple are you for or against it argument. Any of us who have expressed the mildest criticisms of globalisation over time and said, well, hang on a minute, there are winners and losers. Can we talk about some of the losers and how we mitigate against it? Have been told we're kind of, anti-globalisation. I get this all the time with the debates I have on Uber. People kind of say, oh, well, you're a Luddite, you're against technology, you're against competition. It's not that at all. I'm pro-innovation, pro-technology, pro-competition, but you can't always pretend that there aren't downsides and that you shouldn't mitigate against it. So I definitely wouldn't go into the next election, Michael, going, we're for the single market, suck it up, there's no alternative.
But you would go into the next election saying we're for the single market.
Yeah, sure. And actually, the alternative, Michael, is that we're outside of the single market, and a Labour government's job doing all the things that we want to do is a hell of a lot harder outside of that trading bloc.
All right, just one sec. While you respond to that, we're coming up to an hour. So if you want to put some questions in, I'll ask a few of them. But while they're coming, you continue your response, Tom.
Well, so that's why the form of it matters. That's why the ability to say no matters. That's why at the heart of our shared market model is to make it an active sovereign choice to align so that you're having that discussion with people. I think the great deceit of British politics over the last 40 years has been passing off unpopular choices made in Westminster as instructions that have been received from Brussels. Mm-hmm. That's been the deceit at the heart of British politics. And I can understand why people come to the Lexit position, but I think they're being duped. And they're being duped because they're being told by people that you have to implement a kind of neoliberal policy programme because the European Union insists upon it. And that is just simply untrue. It's a bit like saying economic problems are the fault of immigrants. It's blaming another. It's that othering in British politics. And we should take responsibility for the choices that have been made in this country. Most of the problems that we have, in fact, nearly all the problems that we have in this country, are entirely self-authored. And the way that I know that, and for any Lexiteer who gives an argument that this is all coming from Brussels, just go and meet Denmark, right? In Denmark, the state is 57% of GDP. In the UK, the state is 38% of GDP. In Denmark, the difference between the poorest and the richest is 5-fold. In the UK, it's 11-fold. So this idea that somehow you can't have a fairer, more equal society with a bigger role for the state, investing in the common good, building good lives for people in the framework of the European Union is false. Yep. And what has happened is that people have made the argument when they are passing off their project to cut back and attack the state that somehow this is a compulsion from Brussels. It's not. They've chosen to do it. We could have made a different choice. No one imposed austerity on this country. Austerity was imposed on this country by its own politicians, not by the IMF. It wasn't imposed upon us by the World Bank. It wasn't imposed upon us by the European Union. It was a policy that originated in Westminster and was led, managed and implemented by the Conservative Party in Westminster. And I think it breaks down accountability because it buys into that frankly bullshit argument that somehow all our problems are someone else's fault. They're not. Our problems are our own fault and we can fix them if we want to. There's extraordinary fatalism in this country about the state of the economy, and people no longer believe that it can be fixed. That's not true. And the reason that we know that's not true is that other countries take a different path, and we could choose to be more like them and less like the policies that we've been implementing since the late 1970s.
Yep.
All right, we've got some questions. And you touched on some Lexit arguments there. If you've watched this and you've been disappointed by the lack of advocation for a hardcore Lexit, tune in a few weeks' time where we'll have Kostas Lapavitsas giving the classic Lexit position. Maybe I'll get one of you back on to debate him.
Love to debate.
Some questions. I'll direct this to Wes. Isn't the crucial amendment the one on the meaningful vote? So this is the one that actually could bring down the government, basically, right?
I don't know if it bring down the government. This is the most important.
Well, it couldn't bring the government down now, but the point is that
further
when
down
they
the track,
further down the track,
in my view, this is the most important vote, and it's one we've still got a chance of winning.
And so, if that's as a follow-up, if that's the most important vote, why would it be sensible for the Labour Party to sort of do a symbolic vote about something it doesn't actually agree with, which would be the EEA?
Well, bear in mind we've got 15 votes through the House of Lords, so we can multitask in Parliament. It's not either or. We're not plumping for the meaningful vote
what I mean is
or for the EEA.
You seem like the voting for the EEA is the only way to make life difficult for the government.
No,
so much so that it's worth voting for a proposal that's not actually very good.
No, that's why at the outset I made it very clear that I would be supporting the amendments that Labour's defending from the Lords, as well as Kieran Jeremy's amendment this week, because I think they are important amendments. I don't think that kind of detracts from the wider point I was making about where we could have got on the single market. But, you know, that's almost water under the bridge now. It will certainly be in a couple of days. But the arguments that have kind of bubbled to the surface from the EEA debate, I think are important ones. It's actually been a belated, but I think necessary and mostly healthy debate had within the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, there have been a couple of times where I think the debate has got a bit personalised and unpleasant, and certainly I'm not going to criticise Labour MPs who are taking a different view and say they're not, you know, putting the national interest first, or they're not being patriotic, or not safeguarding their voters. We're all trying to wrestle through what is quite a difficult and complicated set of issues, which are particularly difficult for the Labour Party, which is why I've not sort of come on and said, I think this is awful, the leadership's terrible, and all of my colleagues who aren't voting for it are a disgrace, because I don't believe any of those things. I think this is just, there are difficult issues we're trying to wrestle with. And I personally, as I said, I think we're missing a trick with the EEA amendment, but I'll dry my eyes and hope we're going to win the other two that we're really pushing for.
Do you want to respond to that, or do you want a Lexit question?
Let's go for a Lexit question.
Right.
Isn't it true?
Well, we've gone round it so many
times. Isn't it true that
out.
People's QE would break the Maastricht Agreement? No? All right, we'll get Kostas Lapavitsas on later to maybe have a different answer to that. I don't know enough to challenge that.
No, I mean there are different. I mean, People's QE just on a technical basis, right? I mean, the way that QE currently works is £445 billion in a rolling programme of money creation, and that is used to buy corporate bonds of existing businesses. So it's buying up private debt. If you'd had so-called People's QE, you might have had investment directly in the real economy, but the fundamental mechanism is much more similar than it is different. So it will be a form of stimulus, and money creation. It doesn't contravene Maastricht. The European Central Bank has a big program of quantitative easing itself, as has the Federal Reserve. So the idea that somehow one variant of money creation is permitted but another isn't just isn't true.
It's not related to the EU, but so many people have asked it. I've got to. What are Wes's views on mandatory reselection? I want to get you on a show to specifically debate this, but so I won't do too many follow-ups.
Great idea. I think that firstly, people don't realise that they are perfectly able to deselect their MPs within the current rules of the Labour Party. It's not a power that is used very often, but it is there for members to exercise if they wish, and they are perfectly entitled to do that. I do think that since the general election, there is much more calm and common purpose in the Parliamentary Labour Party and in the Labour Party more generally than existed in the last Parliament. And I think as we're debating rule changes, and Katie Clark's doing her review, I think it would be a real mistake to open up internal battles when there is actually a great degree of common purpose. I mean, even on the EEA amendment this week, where there's a difference of opinion, the debate has mostly been managed in a respectful way. So I think rather than having a debate about ourselves and our own structures, we should be focusing on the Tories. And the other thing I would say is if, as I know some of your viewers would like and some of my correspondents on Twitter would like, there was mass deselection of Labour MPs, and you kind of see the lists and my name's occasionally on it. Let's not pretend that this would be a consequence-free choice. There would inevitably be consequences for the Labour Party in doing that, not in terms of how we would respond or the choices that we might make, but actually in terms of how we're perceived by the voters. And Paul Mason made a very good point in the aftermath of the local elections about the pattern of results across the country. And he said we need to win back centrist voters in places like the Midlands, that we need to win a majority. And my argument is to form a coalition in the country, you need to have the coalition inside the party. And though I think we need to be much better in this parliament at managing some of the disagreements, at taking some of the heat and some of the aggression out of our political discourse at every level of the party, and there is still much work to be done on that front, I hasten to add, I think actually we've got to pull together as a party. And if we don't do that, we have got no chance of winning the next general election. And I do want to see a Labour government after the next general election. So mandatory reselection gets a big thumbs down from me. And people should stop viewing every debate inside the Labour Party as a proxy for what we think of Jeremy Corbyn. I can tell you that in the Parliamentary Labour Party, there is next to no discussion about Jeremy Corbyn's position as leader of the Labour Party, because we kind of got the message twice. So I think we've moved on. We're trying to make the best of it. I'm never going to be president of the Jeremy Corbyn fan club, but I will be working very hard to make sure that we get a Labour government after the next general election, working hard in marginal seats near my own, making sure we keep seats like mine, and making sure the Labour leadership hears the voices of voters that we need to win over in order to win the next general election. And I think we've got to create a more healthy, pluralist, inclusive culture at every level of our party, and I'm not sure a debate about mandatory selection helps that.
All right, let's get you on for a different show. We'll get some beers and we'll talk about mandatory selection.
Yeah,
I was promised
beers on this programme. All I've had is a bottle of Smart Water.
Let's give it a rest. I'm getting too hot. I want to get some fresh air. Any final points you think the world needs to hear about the shared market and the single market before we go off air?
No, can I plug our Commission on Economic Justice?
Yes, you can.
Really
so I'm just going to plug that. Our final report is coming out in September. And just this week we've published a paper on union membership and how to revive trade unions. So do have a look at IPPR.org. It's a fantastic paper. It's done some analysis on what's been happening in terms of trade unions in the workplace and some really interesting recommendations as to how to boost trade union membership. So take a look at that. And next week, we're coming up with our big plan on how to fix the NHS and give it its long-term funding settlement that it needs. So lots of stuff going on at IPPR.
And Wes, maybe we can finish on some gossip. How many people are going to rebel with you?
I genuinely don't know. I'm sorry, I'm useless on
you need to get in the right WhatsApp groups, Wes.
No, I'm obviously not like high enough up the food chain. I'm a minion, but. No, but on a serious note, sort of final plugs. We've got the Lewisham by-election coming up this week. We should never take voters for granted. It's really important we're all out campaigning. And if you haven't got enough of the Lewisham by-election, we've got council by-election in Brent. But even more interestingly, from my perspective on the sort of London-Essex border, we've got a couple of Basildon by-elections taking place a week on Thursday, where we can see Labour councillors elected in an area which tends to be more UKIP-y. So if people fancy helping getting some more Labour councillors elected in a part of Essex where we need to get Labour MPs returned, then Basildon is the place to be too.
Great. Well, this was TyskySour. Thanks so much for both coming on.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you very much.
To get you back. Can you get some more of your friends to come as well?
Why do they say no to you?
Well, we always want more people who disagree with us, but then they're not up for it.
It's probably because the last time they saw me in a video with you, you made me sing "Oh Jeremy Corbyn."
I think that was...
And I've never lived it. I've never lived
Should
it
we do another one?
I think you should do it again. Do it again, Wes.
No, stop this.
Do it again.
Well, Pride's coming up soon. Maybe I'll be able to corner you again.
Maybe I'm now going to avoid you like the plague. I've not got my right singing voice on today. But
This was TyskySour. We'll see you in a week as ever. If you want to support the show, go to support.novaramedia.com. Our subscribers make this possible. Thank you for your comments. You've been excellent. And we'll see you in a week's time.